So, dear followers of dewereldmorgen.be, that's the world tomorrow in English, tonight we have the to two of the most prominent voices of the left in the world, Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad. Welcome. The occasion is the publication of the Dutch translation of their book, The Withdrawal, in an excellent translation by Tineke Jager, just barely 1 week after the English original. Very good. Professor Noam Chomsky needs no introduction to our followers. We publish translations of his articles and interviews on a regular basis, and they are very well read. At 93 years of age, he is still at it about the world as ever. His historical knowledge and analysis remain an essential tool of information. I personally discovered him in 1979 with the double political economy of human rights with Edward Herman. I went back from there to his previous books, well, and never stopped reading. Way back then, when I started, I was convinced I was the only one in the country who read such books, like from the likes of, well, I could not be more wrong. To read Chomsky is to gain understanding of the world as it really is, as today with this new book. Vijay Prashad, whom I had the privilege to meet here in Ostend 1 year ago. Vijay, as you remember, we stood in front of the big statue of our common mutual friend, Leopold II, 1 year ago. You keep amazing me and our readers with your keen knowledge and understanding of the world. You travel around the world, talk to the people that matter. I saw your picture with Lula in Brazil. You know, to our readers, to our followers, he really is the new guy to follow. He's also a prolific writer, author of many books and articles. One of them, by the way, is Washington Bullets, translated in Dutch, even with the title that even English people can understand, Imperialism for Beginners. Google him for many more. Vijay, Professor, welcome. I just read the translation, the Dutch translation of The Withdrawal, great forward by Angela Davis, by the way. So last year, the two of you had talks about a range of subjects. It's a look back and look forward, starting from that withdrawal from Afghanistan. Vijay, you also mentioned several other books from the past, like American Power and the New Mandarins and the Backroom Boys, all books that are really essential to read even today. Now, Vijay and Professor, in your talks, you go back in time to that other withdrawal in 1975, the one from Vietnam. And also you talk, very important, about that forgotten country in that war, Laos. I mean, could I have the both of you, your view on both withdrawals? How similar or different are they? And why does it matter today to know this history? Please.
Well, this was a large part of my life, I should say, from about 1960 until to the present. In fact, I was able to visit Laos, spend some time there in 1970. Also visited North Vietnam at the same time, but was deeply involved in both. But why should we be concerned about them? I think they're the most important events since the Second World War. There's been nothing comparable to the US devastation of Indochina, which includes Cambodia, which I didn't get to. The bombing of Cambodia in the early 70s. It's one of the gravest modern crimes. It was carried out on the orders of one of the great modern war criminals, the highly respected Henry Kissinger, who transmitted to the Air Force the orders of his half-drunk president. The words were, massive bombing of Cambodia, anything that moves, anything that flies against anything that moves. I doubt that you can find in the archival record a comparable call for mass genocide, you might look. Anything that flies against anything that moves. Well, it was done. Among other consequences, it led to the enormous growth of the Khmer Rouge, from a small guerrilla movement to a mass of infuriated peasants seeking revenge. The consequences we know. In the case of Laos, it was basically, it's probably the most heavily bombed area in history, northern Laos. It was a sideshow, had almost nothing to do with the Indochina War. There was a trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which led to support for the South Vietnamese in their resistance against US invasion, which was the main central role. But northern Laos, where the bombing was, had nothing to do with it. In fact, the US high officials conceded in Congress that much of the bombing of northern Laos was undertaken when there were bombing halts over North Vietnam, and they had nothing to do with the planes. So let's bomb northern Laos. Probably about as primitive a society as you can imagine. Scattered villagers, and most of them didn't even know they were in Laos. I was able to interview lots of refugees who fled when the CIA sent a mercenary army through the region to drive them out. Right to the present, there are children dying from unexploded bomblets, little tiny small bombs that are scattered around with which a kid will just pick up because it looks interesting and explodes in his face. The US is doing almost nothing to help with the removal of the bombs. The British are doing something. But the main target of the attack was South Vietnam, always. Devastating attack on South Vietnam. Why should we understand about it? Well, because it is the worst major crime since the Second World War. Enormous consequences. What about the withdrawal? Why did the US withdraw? Well, there was a huge offensive uprising. It's called an offensive. It was actually a popular uprising in January 1968. One of the most amazing events in modern history. The country, South Vietnam, was completely saturated with US troops and troops of the Saigon Army that the US had established, over 1 million of them. Every village had informers, troops, and so on. The uprising was unknown to the occupiers. It was organized, but without any spilling out of information that was going to happen. Happened all over the country. It made it very clear. I mean, the US was able finally to put it down with tons of bombing and massacres and so on. But it made it very clear to the leadership in the United States they can't win this war at any acceptable cost. So it set in motion the beginnings of the long withdrawal, which had innumerable monstrous crimes during it, but it finally ended. According to the standard version, almost universal, the US lost the war. That's a very revealing concept. The fact is the US attained all of its war aims. The only thing it failed to do was turn Vietnam into something like the Philippines, a colony. Didn't manage that. The Vietnamese were able to resist sufficiently to survive. But in other respects, if you look at the internal record, the US attained its goals. Back to the early 650s, when the US intervened to support the French colonialism, and then took over themselves. The goals were very straightforward. The goals were to prevent a successful, independent Vietnam, which would be a model that might be followed by others in the region. Borrow Henry Kissinger's terminology, Vietnam might be a virus that would spread infection.
Yes.
That was his term for the Allende regime. He was instrumental in overthrowing. Well, what did that mean in Indochina? It meant that the model might spread to others. Thailand, Burma, maybe even Indonesia, which was a real prize, enormous resources, powerful country. And if the virus spread that far, Japan might accommodate to it as its industrial commercial center and use Southeast Asia as basically its resource base. The US had fought the Second World War to prevent that. That was the goal of the Pacific War, prevent Japan from establishing a new order in Asia. And in the early 1950s, the United States was not prepared to lose the Pacific War. So let's go in and smash up. What do you do when you have a virus that's spreading infection? Destroy the virus and inoculate the victims. How? By imposing brutal, vicious dictatorships, country after country, that will suppress any effort to follow the same path. That was achieved. Every country of the region had a brutal dictatorship installed backed by the US, and the virus was not totally destroyed, but it was not going to be a model for anyone. The final success was in 1965 in Indonesia, when a murderous military coup took place, supported by the United States, killed millions of people, horrible atrocities. That was a great achievement. So there was a withdrawal. The US didn't achieve its final goals, but it achieved its major goals. A powerful, violent state rarely fails against a third world enemy.
Vijay, please, when reading about this history, what can we learn about what's happening today, about the withdrawal of Afghanistan? How similar or how different is it from that other withdrawal from Vietnam when you look at it now, back and forward?
You know, typically it's always dangerous to make an argument by analogy, you know, yes, looking at something from the past and seeing if there are kind of relations and so on. We live in a very different world today, you know, frankly. In 1975, after the coup in Chile, after the destruction of the possibility of the establishment of sovereignty on the African continent, after the terrible coup Noam just talked about in Indonesia, it felt for the US war planners that the establishment of an alternative foundation in the third world was not going to happen. You know, they were pretty confident. They were so confident that they had destroyed the new international economic order. I mean, there was no real major success in the third world at that time. Well, we're in a very different time now. In our time, the United States is in a much more fragile position economically. The political order within the United States is very fractious. It had been so earlier, but now it's at levels perhaps not seen before. And I think to add insult to injury, at the same time as there are these immense contradictions faced by the United States, China has made an entry onto the world stage. It's made an entry onto the world stage not by sending its military overseas. We shouldn't actually understand it like that because it's not accurate, but by investing its vast capital reserves and by being able to sell the highest kind of technology, the most sophisticated technology at relatively reasonable prices. You know, if you travel to most parts of South America or Africa or Southern Asia, it's impossible to buy the technological products which have the brands of US corporations, you know, like Apple phones and so on. Much easier to buy, you know, Chinese phones. I mean, Chinese phones are the easiest things to buy because they are really reasonable. In the middle are the South Korean phones. You know, Samsung is somewhere in the middle between the Apple phone and Huawei. China has made an appearance on the world, you know, even in a place like Afghanistan, however desperate the situation today, and let me tell you, it is very desperate, 90% of the population in poverty and so on. Nonetheless, the people of Afghanistan need not subordinate themselves entirely to the United States. And that actually is interesting because it is already trading with Iran, it's already trading with China. I think if this conflict in Ukraine dies down, Russian influence will be quite strong in Afghanistan. Well, what are these countries if you include Iran? They are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, founded in 2001. It provides an alternative for countries like Afghanistan. It might eventually provide an alternative for Iraq. I mean, Iraq right now is in political turbulence. Point is that the conditions are different. The world is not the same as it was in 75. China is a major player on the world stage. With the addition of other large countries like Brazil and so on, it will provide an alternative. This is a threat to the United States, so that these withdrawals are not exactly like the withdrawals of the 70s.
There's so much more to be said, and our time is limited. You are addressing with this video a European audience. Elaborate what you said in the book also about the present subservience of Europe to the US as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. I mean, when I read that, I said, well, this subservience goes back way before. And I give the example of my own country. In 1961, the US installed nuclear warheads here in Belgium, not missiles, but bombs to be carried by Belgian planes launched on US orders. Belgium itself has no say in them. They deny their existence even. Now, in the book also you explain that nuclear warheads on land make no sense anymore, that they're only useful if you fire immediately just before you get incinerated. Could you elaborate a bit, the both of you, on this? How did this change, or is it still the same, the present subservience to the US, to NATO, which is US actually?
Well, you can see the subservience very clearly in many dimensions. Take, say, sanctions. The United States is the only country in the world that can impose sanctions. It has enormous power. US sanctions are third-party sanctions. Everyone else has to live up to them, whether they like it or not. Here we see a striking difference between Europe and China. When the US imposes sanctions that Europeans oppose, they abide by them. Europe was strongly opposed to the US sanctions on Iran. US is strongly opposed to the US sanctions on Cuba. They abide by them. They follow the orders of the master. China disregards them. That's what's called the threat of China. It doesn't follow US orders the way Europe does. As far as the missiles are concerned, there's many interesting, it is true that the land-based missiles are mostly a danger to the country that houses them. It's well understood by strategic analysts. The land-based missiles, their position is identified. You have land-based missiles, the Minuteman missiles around the United States. Russia knows exactly where they are. That means they are what are called use them or lose them. If there's any threat in the world, you have to use those missiles or else they're destroyed. That radically increases the threat of war. From a strategic point of view, they're completely useless. Invulnerable submarines have so much firepower that you can't possibly rely on a land-based missile. One Trident submarine, US Trident submarine, can destroy almost 200 cities anywhere in the world. And they're being replaced by Virginia-class submarines, which are much more powerful. The land-based missiles are essentially doing nothing. In the United States, they're there for political reasons. The Pentagon has spread them around in mostly rural areas where the local congressman wants them because they bring in some jobs. So they put pressure on Congress to keep them there. There's some take the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost destroyed the world. What was the missile crisis about? It was about whether the US had the right to keep missiles in Turkey aimed at Russia, but Cuba didn't have the right to have missiles to defend itself from an imminent US invasion. Now, it turned out that the missiles in Turkey were obsolete. They were being replaced by Polaris submarines. So the United States was willing to come close to blowing up the world in order to establish its right to have obsolete missiles in Turkey being replaced by more powerful ones, but Cuba had no right to defend itself from an imminent US invasion. That's what goes on in the world. That's what power is. We see it in case after case. The Belgian missiles you mentioned are another case.
Just to clarify, in Belgium, they're not missiles, they're just warheads that have to be carried by planes who are even more vulnerable because, I mean, it means these planes have to take off and they can be just shot down. Yeah. But anyway, Vijay, you visited Europe on many cases. You came to our country last year. How do you evaluate the present? I mean, when you say Europe, we of course do not necessarily mean the population, but the people in power, this subservience to NATO, and how do you evaluate that?
Well, let's go back a long way, and I'm not going to take us back and narrate the whole story, but look, there's something quite practical. Europe is linked to Asia. This is one giant landmass that goes back to ancient times and so on. Eurasian integration rather, has been blocked on several, counts. Well, colonialism was a big block to Eurasian integration because different European powers captured different parts of Asia and didn't want to create a kind of Eurasian bloc. The Cold War was a big impediment to Eurasian integration. The wall went down the middle. Toward the end of the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev, recently deceased, talked about the common European homeland, could just as well have called it a common Eurasian homeland, on the table, disregarded. Well, since the world financial crisis demonstrated that Europe's, in a sense, proximity to the Americas was not so much, Europe is much further away from the Americas than it imagines, Europe began to naturally integrate with Asia. Two flanks of this integration. One, energy purchases. It's a lot cheaper to buy piped energy from Russia than it is to buy liquefied energy from the Americas. That's just a fact. And hence Nord Stream 1 and 2 were created, and before that other pipelines that went through Poland and so on. Russia integrated into Europe as a deliverer of energy. China integrated with Europe as a deliverer of capital and of goods, as I said earlier, often high-tech goods. That historical integration was taking place. Now, Europe had a decision to make, in the last 10 years. Do we return to the Atlanticist viewpoint? In other words, allow the United States through NATO to define European policy? Or does Europe actually allow itself into this historical integration? In my opinion, the conflict in Ukraine is not so much over Ukraine, and concern for the Ukrainian people might be very loudly proclaimed, but I doubt that that's the objective. The real issue was to either halt or at least to delay the historical integration of Europe with Asia. We saw that before the Ukraine crisis with this ridiculous accusation that Chinese telecommunications companies are coming, to disrupt privacy and security of Europeans. This, by the way, statement was made after it was revealed that the United States was spying not on you, because they of course must be spying on you, but they were spying on Angela Merkel, of all
Yes.
people. They were spying on Angela Merkel. No revelation that Hu Jintao or anybody at the time was spying on Chancellor Merkel. It was the United States. So I see this as Europe's historical choice. Europe must choose between the historical integration, peaceful integration with Asia, creating a kind of Eurasian bloc, or Europe is going to have to go to war to establish itself as a beachhead of US power. That's a choice Europeans have to make. There's a good reason why the Algerians abused Emmanuel Macron the other days. I
Yes.
think Europeans need to look in the mirror. What does Europe want? War or peace? It's your choice.
Yes, absolutely. Vijay, in the final chapter of the book, your afterword, if you call it, you express your admiration for the consistency of Chomsky's analysis over 6 decades. Now, this consistency, is that not also a reflection of the consistency of US foreign policy over all these decades as well? I mean, do elections in the United States make any difference as far as real policy is concerned? I mean, rhetoric, style, and details apart. Noam, Vijay, how do you assess that? Sorry.
No, I think you should take this one because this is about elections and you've seen more elections than I have. Does it make a difference?
Foreign policy, there's a famous statement that foreign policies, political differences stop at the border. Foreign policy remains pretty well fixed. And there's a reason for that. It's institutional. It's been observed long ago that the United States basically is a one-party state, the business party, which has two factions called Democrats and Republicans. If you go back a couple of decades, they weren't very different, somewhat, but what are called moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats were interchangeable. A lot of overlap in the parties. Now that's changed. The Republican Party has drifted off the spectrum. It's not a political party in any normal sense. In international rankings, it ranks alongside the far-right policies in Europe with neo-fascist origins. To be a Republican senator today, you need two qualifications. One is to say no whenever Mitch McConnell, Senate leader, says say no. Anything the Democrats propose, say no. That's one qualification. The other qualification is to go to Mar-a-Lago every couple of weeks to shine Trump's shoes. That's it. Nothing else is required. They're terrified of Trump because he's managed to mobilize a mass of angry, dangerous, political, resentful people who are ready to go to war. If you want to know the future of the Republican Party, take a look at the conferences that just took place in Budapest and Dallas. The hero of the Republican Party is Viktor Orban, who wants to establish a Christian nationalist, racist state, which is what's called an illiberal democracy. So keep the forms, but eliminate the content. That's the darling of the Republican Party. That's where they're going. So we still have the one business party, but one of its factions has drifted off the spectrum. Well, when you have one business party run in effect by concentrated capital, they have pretty shared interests. Not entirely, there are splits, but they have generally shared interests. One interest is to ensure an international environment in which US capital is free without constraints, access resources, markets, and so on. But this is sometimes made explicit. So Bill Clinton, Democrat, he had every president has to have a doctrine. The Clinton doctrine was stated explicitly, namely, the US has the right to use force unilaterally, if necessary, to maintain control over markets and resources. That's the liberal side of the spectrum. Go to the right, it's harsher, but it's a narrow spectrum. And within that spectrum, you sometimes have differences of tactics and so on, but not much in the way of major policy change.
Now, just as a side remark, when I was reading the book, I was you mentioned the book by Hans von Sponeck that did not get a review anywhere. I can relate to this. Von Sponeck was in Brussels a few years ago, and I went to his press conference that he was going to give there. And I turned out to be the only journalist present. So it turned into an interview with von Sponeck, just to, as a side remark. If I may end with some observation, and I'll leave you if you want some final words. You know, here in European mainstream media, which are just regurgitate all the things that the government in the US says. But at the same time, it's quite common here in those media to speak very condescendingly about the average American, you know, about it's mainly about men, their ignorance, etc. Actually, my experience, the finest alternative and progressive media are American media. But they are never mentioned here in the mainstream, that is, let alone used as a source of information, which is precisely what we do. So to wrap up, are there any final words that you would like to say, Vijay, on the book or anything else?
I mean, I'm really happy that EPO has published this book so quickly. I hope people read it. I hope there'll be discussions and debates. I very much hope that the European people come to their senses regarding subservience to NATO principally, but also behind that what NATO really is, which is a kind of Trojan horse for US power. You know, the European people are going to struggle with extraordinarily high energy prices as a consequence of this blindness, this blinding way in which they are refusing to allow negotiations around the war in Ukraine and this historical process of Eurasian integration. I mean, I would say, wake up.
Yes, absolutely. My final word here, there's so much more to be said about this book. And for those of you in the audience who have never read a book by Noam Chomsky or Vijay Prashad, here is your introduction. I'm just warning you, if you read it, you're going to want to read more. Just to find. If you allow me just one word in my own language to our followers. Dank u, volgers van De Wereldmorgen. Vergeet niet ons te steunen en te subscriben op de button daar op YouTube-account. Terugtrekken, nu verkrijgbaar bij EPO. Thank you very much, Vijay Prashad and Noam Chomsky. Bye.